You're listening to The Public Square featuring Dave Zanotti, Rob Walgate, Dr. Jeff Sanders, and Sherry Eisen today. I'm producer Alan C. Duncan, and I'm excited for our conversation. It's a very important topic, talking about China's population numbers and what we in the U.S. can hopefully learn from their mistakes. Dave?
Most of the conversations we hear on the news about China are how basically the United States is getting its pants beat off by China. China's buying up all of our debt. China's buying up all of our land. Big publicly traded corporations are doing all of their purchasing and off-site manufacturing with China. China is got all of our prescription drugs, and they're the ones that make them. By the way, China was responsible, or at least the origin of COVID, and on and on and on and on and on. We get that. Interesting that that's a constant conversation on the right. There doesn't seem to be any necessary blowback or resistance or counter from the left. We hear about the Confucius Institutes in American universities and the collaboration between China and major funded colleges and institutions. But today we want to talk of a very different conversation. We want to talk about the end of China. And some would say, well, the end of China, what are you talking about, the end of the world? No, we're talking about China 30 years from now, when it's basically over. Now, when I first thought about that, I thought, well, this has got to be a fantasy, right? We all get out our tinfoil hats, and this is some kind of a conspiratorial conversation. And recently we've come across a series of articles that make it very clear that China has a big problem that nobody's talking about. So we're going to talk about it today here on the Public Square. Rob, I want to start with you. You're the numbers guy. Lay out what the research shows about China's capacity to go forward into the future as a world power.
It's going to be a struggle. And the reason for that boils down to birth rate. China, for a long time, had a rule implemented that one child per couple or one child per marriage. And they realized that to continue as a world power, to continue the population that China had, they needed to change that. Well, when they instituted the change, and now it's gone from instituting a change to instituting an encouragement to couples or to married people to have more children, the people they're encouraging aren't heeding that call. They limited and they tied their hands on how many children they could have. And now folks in China seem perfectly fine with that. And they're doing nothing to change it. So their replacement level, I believe it's like 1.09 is the replacement level, which you need to be at 2.1 to be at an adequate replacement level. So they are under 50%.
So let's bring up the lead. The big lead is China, by its own admission, has acknowledged that the 30 to 40-year policy of one child per family that was enforced with severe social penalties and financial penalties, and people having to go in hiding if they dared to break the policy and have a second child, which then created an environment of mandatory abortion because people did get pregnant without a doubt past one child, and those pregnancies were all aborted, millions upon millions of dead children. China has now come to the realization that within 30 years, their population will be 1/3 what it is today, and their culture unsustainable because of what they instituted.
Something that people forget is that I do not know the exact number, but a good portion of those children who were aborted from 1979 to 2015, which is when the policy was in effect, were girls, because the Chinese wanted boys. And if you can only have one child, and having the favored son, that's really big in their culture. And so if they found out that they were pregnant with a girl, they got rid of that female baby in the womb. And so now we have we still have a population of over 1 billion people, but it's heavily favored in the favor of male children. You don't have a large female population. Now what are you going to do?
So let's, again, if you're brand new to this program or brand new to the conversation about population replacement rates, you might have been raised in an educational environment where the idea of population was the enemy, that the world is growing too fast, that there's too many people on the planet, that there's too many people in the United States, there's too many people in China, too many people all over the place, and so what we want to do is we want to get to zero population growth. That was a very popular trend over the last generation. And it made its way through the academies. It made its way to pulpits. It certainly made its way throughout the regime of public policy and media. Now, one of the greatest superpowers in the history of the world is having to admit out loud that they have to completely reverse everything that they did because they are about to run out of people sooner than you can imagine because people stopped having babies. Now, they didn't just stop having babies, they stopped getting married.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, these articles that we're reading also seem to indicate that people are just simply purely disillusioned with their government in China.
Yes.
They basically broke the psyche of an entire generation of people. They knocked the will to live and procreate other human beings out of an entire generation of Chinese people. It's devastating to read. And now they're thinking, now the regime wants us to have more kids. And to what? Into your communist government with no opportunities?
Yeah, they've locked up, about 1.5 million Uyghurs, which was the Turkic Chinese ethnic minority in Western China. And they locked people up in their apartment complexes during COVID. So why do I want to feed the beast? But there are some other things too. I mean, it's cheaper to live by yourself than to get married and start having children. It's very restrictive to have children and living in these apartments in China. Why should I go and do that? And plus, I can have a nice life by myself. You live in a distracted world. Just, live on TikTok the rest of your life. Why do I have to engage with somebody who might possibly drive me crazy and then I'm going to have kids? I don't need any of that.
Well, and
people just drop out.
Those were in these articles that we were reading. That's not even you just making that up.
No.
That's stated in these articles.
Yeah.
There was a degradation that took place in all of this too. And I think married couples, if they had a girl, they could, in some circumstances, have a second child, but they had to apply to the government for a birth permit. So they had entered into the most intimate of their lives and decisions of family and home. And population control was a plan that started with something called the Ministry of Health of the People's Republic of China, but it ceased to function in 2013. And there was a single agency that took over that was called the National Population and Family Planning Commission, and that was established. And they had commissions and they had people that monitored, and it was so monitored that women were forced to use contraceptives, they were forced to receive abortions, and to undergo sterilization. And they were penalized. There was something called a social maintenance fee because they were creating a burden on society to have another child. So all that had been in place. And they also went into the school systems, and with the very young, they were teaching them that it was their duty for the national well-being to keep the population low. So all that, they may say that they're changing it and this is now new, but that was ingrained in people.
I've read some articles, and in some places, they also wonder, we talked about that replacement birth rate of 1.09, I believe the article said, but they also said, that is coming from China themselves. And some wonder if it is even, in fact, that high, because there's no secondary entity that is verifying that number. We're being asked to trust the Chinese to give us the number of what it is. And there's some that are saying that it may not even be that high.
Well, this is the ultimate example, or one of the ultimate examples of the phrase "ideas have consequences."
Yes.
Or the Chesterton quote that, Dave, you like to say a lot of, "If you start in the wrong place, you'll go mad." I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I'm not a math guy, but this is literally a math equation. You know, I'm sure, Rob, you probably think it's a simple math equation. You know, you got to replace yourself, or there's going to be no people. They die.
The next time someone tells me they want the government in charge of their health, I'm going to give them this story and say, yeah, the government was in charge of everybody's, quote, health for 40 years in China.
Yes.
This is what you came up with.
Yeah. Yeah. And now they're trying to walk it back. Yeah.
And in making those decisions, because they had the ultimate authority to do so, if there were couples that had another child and that had not been approved, they called them surplus children, and they were sterilized. So those are children that are still around now that also will not be part of a growing population.
The math on this is really pretty basic, and we've been talking about it here on the Public Square for a long time. In a population, there are X number, whatever culture you're in, X number of women of childbearing age. For a population to replace its existing number, the population requires a 2.1 children be born per childbearing aged woman in the culture at that time. Now, that's the math. The math is pretty simple. It's 2.1. That's the population rate. Replacement. If people decide to not have babies, then you hope somebody has 3 kids or somebody has 4 kids. But eventually, if enough people decide they don't want to have children anymore, and that drops below 2.1, then you begin to experience a decline. Now, what's the problem with the decline is it's exponential. Once it is sustained for a series of years, there are no people there of childbearing age. It's a diminishing equation that is literally predicting extinction for the people of China. So much so that there's a hashtag out. I think it came up in one of the articles that's become very popular in China. It's hashtag last generation.
Whoa.
It's very sad. And we've got more to talk about when we come back after this short break.
We will be right back for more on the Public Square. Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
We're talking about China today on the broadcast, and several of our team members at the Public Square have actually been there. So let's hear from one of them now.
Jeff, you've spent time in China, as has Wayne Shepard, our co-host here, and many times in China. You've been there. You actually speak a little bit of the language, which you a smidge.
我懂中文一点儿，明天我学习中文。
Were you there during the time, obviously, of this policy, right? You would have had to have been there during this time.
Yes. Yeah, I was there in 1983, 1987, and in 1991. And I've had many good friends who are Chinese from the mainland, and some of them were Christians, and they've told me all kinds of interesting stories about life behind the bamboo curtain there in communist China.
Well, Wayne Shepard has had many of those stories. In fact, Alan, you might remember how Wayne actually did an interview with us from China. Do you remember that?
He did. I remember being very nervous that the tech was not going to work, but it did. It did, miraculously.
It held up, and I remember him talking about the most moving experience that he had in China was listening to Christians literally underground in a cave Everyone's shaking their heads. You all remember that, right? Remember the hymn sing?
Yeah.
The hymn sing of the underground Chinese church that Wayne was there. I think he opened up a microphone and recorded it. You all remember that?
I do, and I've never been there, so I remember it. But for me, it's still kind of tough to imagine because I've never experienced anything like that in real life. I mean, it's one of those instances where I try and think about what it would be like. And I'm like, I'm not even sure I can come close to thinking about what that actually would be like to be monitored at that level, to be as fearful at that level.
Well, when we would go into people's apartment, we were invited into people's apartments, and we would talk to Christians, and they were absolutely terrified because they knew that we were being watched, and we went into their apartment, and they invited us in anyway, and they had some kind of explanation for the PSB, the Public Security Bureau. That's their KGB and everything else that goes along with that. But for me, one of the most moving experiences was watching a film from one of my good friends who was Chinese, and he was in seminary with me. And he ministered to a minority group. Not everybody is Han Chinese. There are like 54 different ethnic groups there in China. And this group had been converted to the Christian faith over 100 years ago by Methodist missionaries. And for Christmas, what did they do? They sang Handel's Messiah. They sang it in English. And these people only had the New Testament in their native language, not in Mandarin Chinese. And I watched it, and I said, they know this? He said, yeah, the missionaries taught it to them about 100 years ago, and they've passed this down. And they were singing the stars down. In short, the Chinese people I got to know over there, Christians or not, were wonderful people. And by and large, they loved America because they knew that when China was flat on its back and nobody was helping them, and the Japanese military was murdering them. The Japanese murdered some 15 million Chinese in World War II. The only country that stuck up for them was the United States of America. They don't like the Russians, don't believe the propaganda, and they don't like a lot of other countries. But by and large, they do love and respect us. Their government, not so much, but the average Chinese do.
Jeff, I'm also mindful of Dr. Thane Uri, who is a professor at Asbury University, who also has taught in many of the major universities over the years in China and continues to have very strong relationships with people there. And we've talked with him many times as well about this entire conversation. And in fact, another member of our staff, Anna Welch, traveled with Dr. Uri to China. And I'm mindful of her conversations about how difficult it was just a few years ago as they traveled to even have any form of communications, knowing they were being watched at all times, knowing in their hotels that you couldn't use the telephones, knowing that you had to be aware of listening devices everywhere, and how on occasion someone would come up and talk with them, and it's impossible to describe if you haven't actually experienced it, coming from a nation which is free, as our country is, to recognize what it's like.
Well, and the sad thing to think about it is that there was a major turning point where China could have become a more Christian nation, but there was a rejection of it, because Christianity reached China by some accounts in the 600s.
Yeah, the Nestorians got there,
and so. But there were just some key turning points where the government or the leadership at the time was rejecting Christianity as a basis to for a civil society.
Yeah, in the reign of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo talked to the great Khan and showed him a crucifix, and the Khan held it up and said, "It's amazing that an instrument of torture should become an object of love." He said, "Send me 100 Christian priests, and we will convert." And so the word went back all the way back to Italy, and 2 set out. and it was not a very successful mission to China. So that was one of several opportunities. Now, the church is growing in China in a perfect police state.
Jeff, is there a state religion in China? Is there an official state religion?
There is not. Buddhism never really took hold in China. Confucianism, which is a philosophy, it is not a religion, is part and parcel of Chinese thought. But Islam is very popular. There's about 100 million Muslims, and they're scattered all over the country. They're in every part of China. And the ones that I have talked to were very interested in what I believed. Of course, I'm sure they have their version of jihadists as well. But the Christian faith has come and gone many times in China. But really in the past 40 years, I'd say even 70 years, it has exploded in growth throughout the land.
There are many worldview lessons we can take here. Rob, go ahead.
I was just thinking as well, when it comes to talking about the church, and as we were talking about birth rate, we know in China as well you can have a social credit score, correct? So the way they monitor each individual, I mean, that can be manipulated on where you can go, what you can do. And I could see them eventually maybe tying that to birth rate or what they're forcing you to do, in essence, inside your own home to get outside your own home. Or as it comes to, we talk about the church and what happens outside your own home.
As soon as you leave your home, there's facial recognition cameras everywhere. You are being monitored 24/7.
Well, I mean, and that's just, that sounds like 1984. I mean, that gets talked about all the time, but that truly does sound Orwellian, as they say, where cameras monitor you everywhere you go to make sure you're
Alan,
fine.
do you think they've gone past Orwell now? I mean, it almost seems like they blew past that one.
I think so. Because at least in 1984, Winston could kind of sit in a corner of his room and write with a pencil, and the camera couldn't see him. So I don't, I don't know if that's even possible anymore.
The opening of chapter 1. Yes.
Yeah.
In the corner.
But even in the perfect police state, everything that they plan and program and everything, it's still collapsing on them. They cannot manipulate everything.
One of the things you'd ask is if they have an official religion. And I'm wondering if science has become their religion, because they kept claiming that there was population science and that they put complete stock into science was the solution to every problem, and that if it was considered a scientific backup, that it was the acceptable course of life. So that trumped anything else to say, we know what's best based on what we're discovering.
Funny how mathematics didn't factor into their science.
Somebody forgot the math, yeah.
Every time we would bring Bibles into the country, and they would catch us with the Bibles that we brought in, and they would shake their finger in our face and say, we don't need these books. We need books of modern technology. And the people that I was with shot back, verbally, of course. How do you this was back in the 80s. How do you think America became so strong? It's because we were founded upon this book and what it says. And they, just dusted that off.
Be fruitful and multiply, right?
Yeah, there's a mandate. Yeah, and the notion that the concept of Christian Science is discovering the world of the Creator.
That's right.
The concept of materialistic science is simply basically figuring out how we can control nature.
That's right.
And isn't that the occult? If you think about it, isn't that what occult magic was always in the ancient world
Turning
trying
lead
to do?
Gold. Yeah.
Can we somehow control and harness this for whatever we want to get out of it?
And then if we get part of it right, the idea then is to weaponize that so that the people who know are more powerful than the people who don't. And the people who don't know serve the people who do. And that's, again, a formula of the godless equation. Everywhere that this godless equation goes, a form of government surely follows that diminishes human liberty. But one of these articles came up with an interesting comment, and that was, and the articles that we've read on this, none of them are Christian articles. They're all articles that have been written from the Atlantic and from the Washington Post and the New York Times and all these other places. And one of the articles made it quite clear that it's very difficult to have public policy that's absent of human agency. And I thought, That person seems to have perhaps been listening to William B. Allen. The idea that you can tell people no all you want, and they will find a way if it's what they want, and you can tell people yes, please do this all you want as the government, and if they don't want to, they won't. The concept of the consent of the governed is universal inside human agency. Once you acknowledge there's human agency, then you have to ask yourself the question, where did it come from? And you can say till you're blue in the face, it is purely a natural phenomenon designed for the survival of the fittest. That's fine. We can argue about the origins all you want. There's just one problem. Even in the highest levels of communism, they tell you stop having babies or else. And so people do to save their lives. And then they say, oops, we were wrong, have babies. And you know what people say? Never mind.
Forget it.
All right, don't go away. We're going into a break now, but we'll be back with more of The Public Square.
We will be right back for more on The Public Square.
Let me reset the table. I'm Alan C. Duncan with Dave Zanotti, Rob Walgate, Dr. Jeff Sanders, and Sherry Eisen, talking China today on the program.
So let's now turn the page and ask ourselves, what can America learn from China in all of this? And is America exempt from this? Are we immune from this? Is this only something that happens now among the Chinese communists? Rob, I see you shaking your head.
Well, there's a couple things. One, I do find it interesting, as Jeff talked about the Bibles in China, that China has no issue putting all the Bibles through the printing press that are happening throughout the world and printing them today and making, I don't know, gazillions of dollars off Christians all over the world because they're the ones that'll print the Bibles for the cheapest. So that's out there.
It's gotten so bad when we got to the place where we wanted to create the Life of Jesus book and bring it back to print, Jesus, His Story. We wanted to have it in a very Bible sort of gift package, a really nice book. And so we went out all over the country. Anna, on our graphic design staff, went out all over the country in the United States to try to find someone that would print a Bible version, leather, gold pages, because this is the New Testament. This is the life of Christ. And we were told across the board, no one in America does that anymore. It's all done in China. So we revised the format more to a textbook, which was its original format. Even at that, we only found 2 companies in America that were willing. So it wasn't religion. It's that they can't compete. And we ended up going with a wonderful Canadian company that did a beautiful job on the book, was very kind and very embracing to the project. And that's how we got it done. That's how we got it done. Rob, think about that.
Yeah,
they not only have all the pharmaceuticals, they got the Bibles.
They've got the Bibles. And, when you talk about it relating to the United States, I think it's very evident when you look at our birth replacement levels in the United States, we have concern. We should have major concern for generations to come at what we've allowed them to dip to. And there's a few things.
How are they matching up? I mean, they're at 1.09. We're surely at 2.1, 2.2.
No. We're not.
We were a few years ago.
Yeah, we were a few years ago. We're under 2. We're under 2.
1.9, I think.
Yeah, we're under 2. You need to be at 2.1. We're at 1.7. You need to be at 2.1 to be at replacement level. We're at 1.7. And there can be we can look at a
Wait
variety
a second. Whoa. Hang on. I'm sorry. Forgive me. That's a timeout. We are in almost the same boat as China.
Getting close.
We're getting there. We're
How
getting
come
there
that
quickly.
isn't headline news everywhere?
Everything else is stealing the headlines.
Well,
and there's an agenda.
Yeah. Well, I know we have 3 segments left. Maybe we can get to it all in the 3 segments. But there's so many things you can point to. I mean, think of let's put it out there. One of the things that is talked about most often in this country is the right to terminate a pregnancy. Mm-hmm. That is one of the most contested issues of the day, and it has been for the last 50 years. And no one wants to talk about the fact.
You're connecting a dot here. Let me see if I'm following this. We're talking about China having a 30 or 40-year mandatory one-child policy that netted out in mandatory abortion and social penalty if you disobeyed. We had for 50 years Roe versus Wade, where the court created an artificial illusion of the right to abortion and then through multiple other cases barred states from being able to promote the sanctity of life, if you will, and mandated that no one could be denied an abortion. And after 50 years of that policy, which wasn't the government demanding that you have an abortion, it was the government protecting all the rights and the abortion industry becoming a billion-dollar enterprise, multi-billion-dollar enterprise in the country and celebrating that right. And we ended up down the same slippery slope as China. We've lost our population base, and people don't want to have babies. Alan, judge me on this one, Alan. You're strong in the pro-life doctrines here as anybody. Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely makes sense. It's devastating to think about. But here's the thing. We were talking about this 10 years ago. I remember when I think it's, why don't people talk about it? They're not thinking about it. You're not thinking about it. You're pursuing, this is Dr. Francis Schaeffer. You're pursuing personal peace and affluence. Just let me get my little piece of the pie, and maybe I'll have kids, maybe, but we're not really creating a culture of life where we're celebrating what life is and celebrating the giver of life. We're not thinking about it. I remember when we talked about this about 10 years ago, the first time I had thought about it, and I brought it up at like a party later that week. And that was the reaction, right? People were like, they were laughing at me. I was like, we're about at the edge of replacement rate. And they just laughed at me. And so it's just so ridiculous. You don't think about it. But if you don't think about it for a generation, then you look up and you're scratching your head and thinking, well, maybe we should have thought about it.
Yeah. And when I think back to the generations previous, I just think about my generation and generations moving forward want to be comfortable, and I'm not sure that they want to grow up. My parents got married at 18, had me when my mom was 20, my dad was 19, and we kind of grew up together a little bit. I know it wasn't easy. I hear all the stories, but they made it.
Well, you weren't easy. I mean, that was
That's a true story. Uncle Jake, they say, was, but I don't know. But it was hard work, and I remember those days, and I remember those. I didn't know it was hard work because. Right. I had a bike. I had kids in the neighborhood I played with. Well, I was never hungry. It wasn't tough for me. But I think now we want to get comfortable. We don't want to get married until we think we're 100% correct and can afford it. Then we don't want to have kids until,
you don't want to take a risk. Anything worth having, it takes a risk and it takes hard work.
Yes, it's not easy. But we live in America where we want everything to be easy. We want everything. We talk about this often at my house. Do you smooth the road of potholes for your kids, or do you teach your kids how to manage potholes? You got to teach your kids how to manage potholes, and sometimes you're going to hit one, but you got to maneuver around them sometimes too. It's not always going to be a perfect situation. It never is. I remember, again, not to rehash, but sharing stories with my son, who's now 15. I'm like, we were going somewhere the other day. I'm like, do you remember going there all the time? And he was like, no. And I'm like, oh, that used to be a Smoothie King. We went there every Thursday night for an hour. He's like, now I think I do remember it. Rachel had master's classes. She had to go to college. We had a newborn and a young son as well. So it was hard, but looking back, it was fun, but it was worth every minute of it.
To be married, you have to be able to sit down and talk to someone face to face and smooth out. You have to listen to people and be willing to compromise and smooth out problems by using, common sense. Last night, I was at a convenience store and I saw a whole group of young people in their late teens, early 20s in a circle at the convenience store, in a circle inside, all facing each other, but nobody was talking. What were they doing?
They were on their phones.
They were all on their phones. And I just stood there stunned and I thought, how are people learning to communicate, to be involved in community and to solve problems together? You have to do that in order to be married. If you're not learning that, you're not going to get married.
Let's go back to, let's stay on this question of marriage, because there's another correlation I think we can learn from China. China has not necessarily been a pro-marriage environment, and their policies of a mandatory one-child policy so invaded the privacy of marriages that people stopped getting married. Now, America, on the other hand, has had a completely different approach. They said everybody can be married. It doesn't matter. Love is love, and whatever you want to do, if a state will recognize it as marriage, it's fine with us because all the rules on marriage are off. That's basically where we are. That's the progression from 2013 to today. And I know, Rob, you always talk about it. When I first was reading Scalia to you back in the Lawrence v. Texas case and telling you what Scalia is saying is we will have a day where we will say all the rules are off. Everybody gets married however they want. You'd said, nah, I don't think so.
Well, you just took it to what I felt in the early 2000s was an extreme. I'm sitting there looking, and you didn't even come close to where we are 20 years later. But yet when you talked about it, I thought it was extreme. Wasn't even, we're so far, we blew so far past it, and you tried to tell us, and I was just like, oh, no.
And
yet,
here we are. Reading Scalia.
Reading Scalia in his Lawrence v. Texas dissenting opinion, yes. And you sent around this morning to the team, in essence, marriage more than a century of change, a marriage chart that I don't even know what to say. It left me speechless.
Thanks, Rob. We're going into a break, but we'll be back for more of The Public Square.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the public square.
So we're talking about the connection between public policy on marriage and what happens in the population. We've seen that China not only collapsed their birth rate past replacement level, but China also, by their invasion and their social engineering, destroyed the concept of safety and privacy inside marriage. And so people now are basically saying, it's too much trouble, it's too much hassle, why bother? Now suddenly China is in a desperate situation that people aren't getting married, their marriage rate has collapsed, their birth rate is so far below population level that they are admitting, replacement level, they're admitting out loud within 30 years, they'll be 1/3 the size they are right now. Think of that right now. Can you imagine? And there's no magic wand that suddenly changes that. They're out there using every tool of persuasion they can as a government, and people are saying, #last generation. I don't want to bring children here. So Rob, let's come back to the question of marriage in the United States. Our approach was, hey, no rules. Anybody gets married however you want. And of course, then our marriage rate should have exploded, right? We should have people being married all over the place. But in fact, what did the chart show?
The chart shows a dramatic decline. I mean, you see high points, and it goes back to 1890, and you see high points of, and this is dealing with the percentage of women that are married. And you're looking at 92% around 1915. You're looking at 90% around 1950. And there was a dip in there in the 30s. But even when you get to the 70s, you're looking at over 75% of women being married. To today, you're at roughly 30%.
Is it any wonder that last year the American population grew at the lowest level since the founding of the country in 1776? There's a direct correlation between marriage and having children. Now, many people listening to this program are going to say, duh, what planet or rock did you just crawl out from under? You just said there's a direct correlation between marriage and childbirth. What world have you been living in? Oh, I'm sorry. I've been studying China. I'm sorry. I've been living in America. I know there used to be the idea of a sequence of order, right? You grew up, you found someone you thought you wanted to spend the rest of your life with, you got married, and you had children, and you raised a family. That used to be the definition of normal. You just told us, Rob, that is nowhere even close to normal any longer.
No, it's not. And they have what they call, I don't know who termed the phrase, the success sequence. Have you heard that phrase?
Yeah.
The success sequence. You get at least a high school degree, you get a job, then you marry before having any children.
Yes.
And it's like the high 90s percentile that you will have, and I'm using air quotes, you will have that middle income family. You will be set up for success.
Yes.
That if you follow that strategy and you do those things. We see often how marriage and two parents in the home set up the ability for a child to be more successful.
A stable environment.
It's not foolproof. I understand that.
Yep.
Right.
But it is a recipe that often yields success.
Well, yes, 100% agreement. But I would say to add to that is when that husband and wife get married, they now, and this is for all of us around here who have kids in the house still, we need to model a good marriage for those kids.
Amen.
We have to
Amen.
look like something you'd want to be a part of.
Yes.
I can tell you from my own personal experience, I loved my parents. They're home with the Lord. They did not model very well. But what I took from that when I was a kid and when I was a teenager is I don't want what they want. I want something better. I want a marriage that actually works.
Right.
And so, when I met my wife, I said, this is what I want. This is what we've got to work on. And so for almost 36 years now, that is what we've been working on. But it's not just the United States or China. I mean, it's all over the world. You look at Italy, you look at much of Western Europe, you look at South Korea and Japan. These highly developed nations are not even at one.
I think every European Union country is below replacement level.
South
as well.
Korea is at 0.83 right now.
Jeff, tell us about Italy, because you spent a lot of time in Italy.
Yeah, I've got family over there now, thanks to my daughter-in-law, and what a wonderful country. I could go on and on and on about the people and the food and everything, but culturally, it is so expensive to live in a city. If you want a job, you have to live in the city to get the job. And so half of your income is taken off the top by the government. If you were ordinary middle class, they take 50% of your income, and that pays for the socialized medicine and all that sort of stuff. So I've talked to married couples there. They say they live in a shoebox. They drive a tiny little Fiat, that's the size of a shoebox. And they have one, maybe two children at the most, because that is all they can afford. But also culturally, a lot of these Italian men will string the woman along they'll date for 10 years, and she wants a ring, and she wants to get married, and, he's getting what he wants, and he just says, hey, why should I have to get married? And a lot of these Italian men in their 30s are living at home with their parents. So there's nothing there to push people.
Are there kids in these towns?
The small towns are dying out. They have towns in Italy where they were selling homes for $1. Now it had strings attached. You had to come, you had to build it up and everything. I was tempted to go buy one of those. Maybe the whole town. That'd be kind of cool.
We should go in together, Jeff.
I think so. Yeah. But if you want to get a job, and if you're an Italian citizen, the best place to go is London, England. London, England has one of the highest populations of Italians in the entire world. In fact, it outnumbers many Italian cities because that's where the jobs are, or in some other like the Netherlands or in Germany. But the population decline in Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and other European countries. It's almost to the point where you can't reverse it. It's really bad.
Well, it takes time to reverse it. And one of the trends in America that's hurting us so badly is, Rob, you're talking about that prioritization of success. Well, what we're finding is not only are there less married women in childbearing ages than ever before, but they're getting married later because of that very issue. It's very much like what you're talking about in Italy, Jeff, where taxation and other high expenses put them in a position where they're now being told by the Federal Reserve, you're not going to own a home because the interest rates are never coming down. They're being told by the home builders that we can never afford to sell you a home because the costs are so high we can't do it. And there's no inventory. And so what ends up happening is they wait later. And guess what? When you're getting married at the age of 28, you've already surrendered a very large portion of the time frame in which you're able to have children. So people aren't having 3 kids. They're having 1. And 1 is not 2.1.
And we have disparaged marriage for a very long time. We've encouraged that you don't get married, that it doesn't have that same value. It is bound to have an effect as time goes on, much as any propaganda could. One of the connect the dots things that I've been a little concerned about is China had written in 1980 their one-child limit into their constitution, whatever their constitution consists of. And my concern as I've looked at America is it started in Ohio. We're going to write measures into our Constitution that are going to talk about population. And one of the things that was used initially in China was it's a population crisis, or it's attributed to income, or it's destroying the environment. And we hear all of these things, and by and large, a lot of people have bought into that idea that children are a nuisance.
Going into our final break, if you have to leave us for any reason now, hear the rest of the conversation on the Public Square mobile app. Look for the lamppost.
We will be right back for more on the Public Square.
Welcome back around the table. Tough conversation today, talking global population problems. Dave, where should we go from here?
So what's it all mean for America? We can see what's happening around the world. And this is not the stuff that you read. Now, I got to be careful because some of the articles that we have today have come from the Atlantic. They've come from the New York Times. They've come from the Washington Post. Even the secularists, even the anti-theists, even the radical progressives are awakening to the fact that the math cannot be fled from. When people don't have natural incentives and a cooperative environment in which to get married and raise children, they don't. Now, this leaves out all of the other distractions of life that keep people from growing up in a realm of reality and respecting the wonder and beauty of marriage, the wonder and beauty of man and woman coming together as one unit and building families, all the stuff that used to be, and I say used to be, I'm not talking about the 1800s. I'm talking about 1970. I mean, this is not a realm that is we're not talking about ancient history. This has always been a period of time in our country in January, since Roe versus Wade in 1973, where people speak out on the question of life. And they question and the necessity and the beauty and the wonder of life. Pro-life marches and pro-life weekends. Well, we saw the tremendous defeat of Roe versus Wade, which people consider to be monumental in our history, and I'm sure the history books will clearly note the day that the Supreme Court acknowledged it had been wrong for 50 years. My question is, will there be anyone left to read the book? Because what was feared was that diminishing the culture of life would be replaced by a culture of self and selfishness. And since in your own lifetime, you really don't experience the consequence of eliminating a population because you and all your friends decided that no one's having kids anymore, you basically, as C.S. Lewis talked about, you have doomed the next generation. You have decided the future of your society. After you're gone, someone else will bear the consequence. Now, you don't have to be religious to participate in this logical conversation. You can hate God, hate the Bible, hate Christianity and every major religion in the world. You can be the world's most profound atheist. There's just one problem. If you got no people, there's nobody to make stuff, buy stuff, and pay the bills. And if you're a progressive who believes in the administrative state, you've got an even bigger problem. There's nobody to tax so that you can take their money and give it to all the other people.
So basically, selfishness leads to an emptiness.
There's a way that seems right unto a man,
Yes.
but the way therein leads to death. We are surrounded by these consequences.
And when I think of today, in contrast to 40, 50, 60 years ago, when we're looking at some of those marriage numbers, when we're looking at the birth rate numbers, a couple today, the percentage of their income that goes just to pay their tax bill, just to pay their tax bill each and every year, from sales tax to property tax to income tax. We can go on and on and on. There's no secret the fact we've moved the mom in many instances out of the home to raise the child to work to help pay that tax bill. Now
Which
you incur
weakens the
child care
fabric of the
costs,
family.
which are so expensive. It's not realistic.
So we weaken the fabric of the family, and then families break apart, and then children grow up terrible. It's never a good thing. Some people handle it better than others, but let's be honest. Look at the rates. The kids today who aren't getting married, a lot of them were kids who come from broken homes.
Why would they want to be a part of that? Why would they want
to be a part of that?
They are saying
And
that. Yes.
And looking through the statistics of all these articles, they're sandbagging even the statistics. The old statement about, 50% of all marriages end in divorce. Yeah, but guess what? Even a higher percentage of second and third marriages end in divorce. And we don't hear that piece of the equation. So let's take a listen. And again, you don't have to be a Bible-believing Christian. You don't have to be a Roman Catholic. You don't have to be any religion. You don't have to be you don't have to be Jewish. You can be Muslim. You don't have to be anything to look at the math, to look at the science. Let's take a listen and hear what Elon Musk had to say about this very subject. Jeff, he was in Italy, and he got on a little riff about population, and even Elon Musk agrees with this.
As simple as it sounds, if people do not have children, there is no new generation. So, I'm very much in favor of humanity expanding and creating a bright and exciting future for the world. But fundamental to the furtherance of human civilization is having humans. As simple and basic as that sounds. And, every year I look at the birth rates and I'm like, it's kind of a bit depressing because birth rates seem to decline every year. My biggest advice to leaders, to government leaders and to the people in general would be to make sure to have children to create the new generation.
So guess what? You can be anything you want to be. And you can even, and I'm not suggesting this is Elon Musk. Let's take an example. You can be a total commercial secularist. You can be a C-suite manager of a massive hedge fund. You can be sitting in the headquarters of Disney World right now. If you have a business that requires consumers, this message is the end of your business. Because without people, there's nobody to buy your stuff. But what people don't think about is the social services sides of this. We accepted an equation starting in the 1960s whereby we would say we have enough prosperity and enough productivity that the people who work can pay for people who either can't work or don't work. Now, it started off with people who can't work, and everyone was in favor of it all the way. Then it became a more expanded entitlement mentality. Now we're in a position where half of the households in America pay nothing in federal income tax. Now, that is an unsustainable model no matter how you parse it. But if you put ourselves in a position of an exceptional drop in population, you've made it even more difficult to pay because you have less people to draw from.
Those tax bills are going to get higher and higher and higher for the future workers because they're going to have to take care of the people that are getting up there in age and dying off.
Now, the great irony in all of this, as Sherry intimated, is right now, the battle cry of the progressive movement in America is to celebrate abortion and to only elect people who are 100% pro-abortion in any circumstances at all times. And there is a huge attack on the pro-life community from the singular media of America. I just wonder if someday, any day, even the one-party press in America will read the same articles from the Washington Post and the Atlantic and the New York Times. They will study China, they will study Europe and Italy, and acknowledge the fact that there are two sides to this deadly issue. And that without a culture of life, you lose your culture altogether.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Sherry, Rob, and Jeff for walking us through a sobering conversation today on the Public Square. So thanks to you, our listeners, for listening and sharing these broadcasts. For more information, visit us at thepublicsquare.com.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.